voice. "Convicts, runaways, guard! This way for the runaway convicts!" Then both voices would seem to be stifled in a struggle, and then would break out again. And when it had come to this, the soldiers ran like deer, and Joe too. The sergeant ran in first, when we had run the noise quite down, and 2 of his men ran in close upon him. Their pieces were cocked and levelled when we all ran in. "Here are both men," panted the sergeant, struggling at the bottom of a ditch. "Surrender, you two, and confound you two for wild beasts. Come asunder." Water was splashing, and mud was flying, and oaths were being sworn, and blows were being struck, when some more men went down into the ditch to help the sergeant, and dragged out separately my convict and the other one. Both were bleeding and panting and excrating and struggling, but of course I knew them both directly. "Mind," said my convict, wiping blood from his face with his ragged sleeves, and shaking torn hair from his fingers. "I took him. I gave him up to you. Mind that." "It's not much to be particular about," said the sergeant. "It'll do you small good, my man, being in the same plight yourself. Handcuffs there." "I don't expect it to do me any good. I don't want it to do me more good than it does now," said my convict with a greedy laugh. "I took him. He knows it. That's enough for me." The other convict was livid to look at, and in addition to the old bruised left side of his face, seemed to be bruised and torn all over. He could not so much as get his breath to speak until they were both separately handcuffed, but leaned upon a soldier to keep himself from falling. "Take notice, guard. He tried to murder me," were his first words. "Tried to murder him?" said my convict disdainfully. "Try and not do it? I took him, and I give him up. That's what I done. I not only prevented him getting off the marshes, but I dragged him here, dragged him this far on his way back. He's a gentleman, if you please, this villain. Now the hulks has got his gentleman again through me. Murder him? Worth my while too to murder him, when I could do worse and drag him back." The other one still gasped. He tried to murder me. Bear witness." "Looky here," said my convict to the sergeant. "Single-handed I got clear of the prison ship. I made a dash and I done it. I could have got clear of these deaf cold flats likewise. Look at my leg. You won't find much iron on it. If I hadn't made the discovery that he was here, let him go free. Let him profit by the means as I found out. Let him make a tool of me afresh and again. Once more? No, no, no. If I had died at the bottom there," and he made an emphatic swing at the ditch with his manacled hands, "I'd have held to him with that grip that you should have seen safe to find him in my hold." The other fugitive, who was evidently in extreme horror of his companion, repeated, "He tried to murder me. I should have been a dead man if you had not come up." "He lies," said my convict with fierce energy. "He's a liar born, and he'll die a liar. Look at his face. Ain't it written there? Let him turn loose those eyes of his on me. I defy him to do it." The other, with an effort at a scornful smile, which could not, however, collect the nervous working of his mouth into any set expression, looked at the soldiers, and looked about at the marshes and at the sky, but certainly did not look at the speaker. "Do you see him?" pursued my convict. "Do you see what a villain he is? Do you see those grovelling and wandering eyes? That's how he looked when we were tried together. He never looked at me." The other, always working and working his dry lips and turning his eyes restlessly about him far and near, did at last turn them for a moment on the speaker with the words, "You are not much to look at," and with a half taunting glance at the bound hands. At that point my convict became so frantically exasperated that he would have rushed upon him but for the interposition of the soldiers. "Didn't I tell you," said the other convict then, "that he would murder me if he could?" And anyone could see that he shook with fear, and that there broke out upon his lips curious white flakes like thin snow. "Enough of this parley," said the sergeant. "Light those torches." As one of the soldiers, who carried a basket in lieu of a gun, went down on his knee to open it, my convict looked round him for the first time and saw me. I had alighted from Joe's back on the brink of the ditch when we came up, and had not moved since. I looked at him eagerly when he looked at me, and slightly moved my hands and shook my head. I had been waiting for him to see me, that I might try to assure him of my innocence. It was not at all expressed to me that he even comprehended my intention, for he gave me a look that I did not understand, and it all passed in a moment. But if he had looked at me for an hour or for a day, I could not have remembered his face ever afterwards as having been more attentive. The soldier with the basket soon got a light and lighted 3 or 4 torches and took one himself and distributed the others. It had been almost dark before, but now it seemed quite dark, and soon afterwards very dark. Before we departed from that spot, 4 soldiers standing in a ring fired twice into the air. Presently we saw other torches kindled at some distance behind us, and others on the marshes on the opposite bank of the river. "All right," said the sergeant, "march." We had not gone far when 3 cannon were fired ahead of us with a sound that seemed to burst something in my ear. "You are expected on board," said the sergeant to my convict. "They know you are coming. Don't straggle, my man. Close up here." The 2 were kept apart, and each walked surrounded by a separate guard. I had hold of Joe's hand now, and Joe carried one of the torches. Mr. Wopsle had been for going back, but Joe was resolved to see it out, so we went on with the party. There was a reasonably good path now, mostly on the edge of the river, with a divergence here and there where a dyke came with a miniature windmill on it and a muddy sluice gate. When I looked round I could see the other lights coming in after us. The torches we carried dropped great blotches of fire upon the track, and I could see those 2 lying smoking and flaring. I could see nothing else but black darkness. Our lights warmed the air about us with their pitchy blaze, and the 2 prisoners seemed rather to like that, as they limped along in the midst of the muskets. We could not go fast because of their lameness, and they were so spent that 2 or 3 times we had to halt while they rested. After an hour or so of this travelling, we came to a rough wooden hut and a landing place. There was a guard in the hut, and they challenged, and the sergeant answered. Then we went into the hut, where there was a smell of tobacco and whitewash, and a bright fire, and a lamp, and a stand of muskets, and a drum, and a low wooden bedstead, like an overgrown mangle without the machinery, capable of holding about a dozen soldiers all at once. 3 or 4 soldiers who lay upon it in their greatcoats were not much interested in us, but just lifted their heads and took a sleepy stare, and then lay down again. The sergeant made some kind of report and some entry in a book, and then the convict, whom I call the other convict, was drafted off with his guard to go on board first. My convict never looked at me, except that once. While we stood in the hut, he stood before the fire looking thoughtfully at it, or putting up his feet by turns upon the hob, and looking thoughtfully at them as if he pitied them for their recent adventures. Suddenly he turned to the sergeant and remarked, "I wish to say something respecting this escape. It may prevent some persons laying under suspicion along of me." "You can say what you like," returned the sergeant, standing coolly looking at him with his arms folded, "but you have no call to say it here. You'll have opportunity enough to say about it and hear about it before it's done with, you know." "I know, but this is another point, a separate matter. A man can't starve, at least I can't. I took some victuals up at the village over yonder, where the church stands almost out on the marshes." "You mean stole," said the sergeant. "And I'll tell you where from the blacksmith's." "Halloa," said the sergeant, staring at Joe. "Halloa, Pip," said Joe, staring at me. "It was some broken victuals, that's what it was, and a dram of liquor and a pie." "Have you happened to miss such an article as a pie, blacksmith?" asked the sergeant confidentially. "My wife did at the very moment when you came in. Don't you know, Pip?" "So," said my convict, turning his eyes on Joe in a moody manner, and without the least glance at me. "So you're the blacksmith, are you? Then I'm sorry to say I've eat your pie." "God knows you're welcome to it, so far as it was ever mine," returned Joe with the saving remembrance of Mrs. Joe. "We don't know what you have done, but we wouldn't have you starved to death for it, poor miserable fellow critter. Would us, Pip?" Then something I'd noticed before clicked in the man's throat again, and he turned his back. The boat had returned, and his guard were ready, so we followed him to the landing place made of rough stakes and stones, and saw him put into the boat, which was rowed by a crew of convicts like himself. No one seemed surprised to see him, or interested in seeing him, or glad to see him, or sorry to see him, or spoke a word, except that somebody in the boat growled as if to dogs, "Give way, you," which was the signal for the dip of the oars. By the light of the torches we saw the black hulk lying out a little way from the mud of the shore, like a wicked Noah's Ark, cribbed and barred and moored by massive rusty chains. The prison ship seemed to my young eyes to be ironed like the prisoners. We saw the boat go alongside, and we saw him taken up the side and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung hissing into the water and went out, as if it were all over with him. End of chapter 5.
Thank you for the follow at KorovTuber1.
Hey.
Hey.
Thanks for the follow. How are you doing, Cora? Ooh. This is not looking great.
Chapter 6 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My state of mind regarding the pilfering from which I had been so unexpectedly exonerated did not impel me to frank disclosure, but I hope it had some dregs of good at the bottom of it. I do not recall that I felt any tenderness of conscience in reference to Mrs. Joe when the fear of being found out was lifted off me. But I loved Joe, perhaps for no better reason in those early days than because the dear fellow let me love him. And as to him, my inner self was not so easily composed. It was much upon my mind, particularly when I first saw him looking about for his file, that I ought to tell Joe the whole truth. Yet I did not, and for the reason that I mistrusted that if I did, he would think me worse than I was. The fear of losing Joe's confidence, and of thenceforth sitting in the chimney corner at night staring drearily at my forever lost companion and friend, tied up my tongue. I morbidly represented to myself that if Joe knew it, I never afterwards could see him glance, however casually, at yesterday's meat or pudding when it came on today's table, without thinking that he was debating whether I had been in the pantry. That if Joe knew it, and at any subsequent period of our joint domestic life remarked that his beer was flat or thick, the conviction that he suspected tar in it would bring a rush of blood to my face. In a word, I was too cowardly to do what I knew to be right, as I had been too cowardly to avoid doing what I knew to be wrong. I had had no intercourse with the world at that time, and I imitated none of its many inhabitants who act in this manner. Quite an untaught genius, I made the discovery of the line of action for myself. As I was sleepy before we were far away from the prison ship, Joe took me on his back again and carried me home. He must have had a tiresome journey of it, for Mr. Wopsle, being knocked up, was in such a very bad temper that if the church had been thrown open, he would probably have excommunicated the whole expedition, beginning with Joe and myself. In his lay capacity, he persisted in sitting down in the damp to such an insane extent that when his coat was taken off to be dried at the kitchen fire, the circumstantial evidence on his trousers would have hanged him if it had been a capital offence. By that time I was staggering on the kitchen floor like a little drunkard, through having been newly set upon my feet, and through having been fast asleep, and through waking in the heat and lights and noise of tongues. As I came to myself, with the aid of a heavy thump between the shoulders and the restorative exclamation, "Yah, was there ever such a boy as this?" from my sister, I found Joe telling them about the convict's confession, and all the visitors suggesting different ways by which he had got into the pantry. Mr. Pumblechook made out, after carefully surveying the premises, that he had first got upon the roof of the forge, and had then got upon the roof of the house, and had then let himself down the kitchen chimney by a rope made of his bedding cut into strips. And as Mr. Pumblechook was very positive, and drove his own chaise cart over everybody, it was agreed that it must be so. Mr. Wopsle indeed wildly cried out "No!" with the feeble malice of a tired man, but as he had no theory and no coat on, he was unanimously set at naught. Not to mention his smoking hard behind as he stood with his back to the kitchen fire to draw the damp out, which was not calculated to inspire confidence. This was all I heard that night before my sister clutched me as a slumberous offence to the company's eyesight, and assisted me up to bed with such a strong hand that I seemed to have 50 boots on, and to be dangling them all against the edges of the stairs. My state of mind, as I have described it, began before I was up in the morning, and lasted long after the subject had died out, and had ceased to be mentioned, saving on exceptional occasions. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At the time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones, I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction, even of their simple meaning, was not very correct, for I read "wife of the above" as a complimentary reference to my father's exaltation to a better world. And if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I have no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration was to walk in the same all the days of my life, laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down by the wheelwrights or up by the mill. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity, I was not to be what Mrs. Joe called Pompey, or as I render it, pampered. Therefore I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbour happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds, or pick up stones, or do any such job, I was favoured with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on the kitchen mantel-shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually towards the liquidation of the national debt, but I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening, in the society of youth who paid 2d per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She rented a small cottage, and Mr. Wopsle had the room upstairs, where we students used to overhear him reading aloud in a most dignified and terrific manner, and occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There was a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once a quarter. What he did on those occasions was to turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, and give us a Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. That was always followed by Collins's Ode on the Passions, wherein I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as Revenge, throwing his blood-stained sword in thunder down, and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, as it was in later life, when I fell into the society of the passions, and compared them with Collins and Wopsle, rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had, or what the price of anything in it was, but there was a little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices, and by this oracle Biddy arranged all the shop transaction. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem, what relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan like myself, like me too, had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect of her extremities, for her hair was always wanted brushing, her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at heel. This description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays she went to church elaborated. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that I fell amongst those thieves, the 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began, in a pure-blind groping way, to read, write and cipher on the very smallest scale. One night I was sitting in the chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marshes, for it was a long time after, and it was winter and a hard frost, with an alphabet on the hearth at my feet for reference. I contrived in an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. My dear Joe, I hope you write well I hope I shall soon be able for to teach you, Joe, and then we shall be so glad. And when I'm 'prentice to you, Joe, what larks bleed me in XN Pip. There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me and we were alone. But I delivered this written communication, slate and all, with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. "I say, Pip, old chap," cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide, "what a scholar you are, aren't you?" "I should like to be," said I, glancing at the slate as he held it, with a misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. "Why, here's a J," said Joe, "and an O, equal to anything. Here's a J and an O, Pip, and a J-O, Joe." I had never heard Joe read aloud to any greater extent than this monosyllable, and I observed at church last Sunday, when I accidentally held our prayer book upside down, that it seemed to suit his convenience quite as well as if it had been all right. Wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, "Ah, but read the rest, Joe." "The rest, Pip?" said Joe, looking at it with a slow, searching eye. 1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's and 3 O's, and there's 3 J-O's, Joe's in it, Pip." I leaned over Joe, and with the aid of my forefinger read him the whole letter. "Astonishing," said Joe, when I had finished. "You are a scholar." "How do you spell Gargery, Joe?" I asked him with a modest patronage. "I don't spell it at all," said Joe. "But supposing you did?" "It can't be supposed," said Joe, "though I'm uncommon fond of reading too." "Are you, Joe?" "Uncommon. Give me," said Joe, "a good book or a good newspaper, and sit me down afore a good fire, and I ask no better. Lord," he continued, after rubbing his knee a little, "when you do come to a J and an O, says you, here at last is a J and an O, Joe. How interesting reading is." I derived from this that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, I inquired, "Didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "No, Pip." "Why didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "Well, Pip," said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself to his usual occupation when he was thoughtful, of slowly raking the fire between the lower bars, "I'll tell you my father, Pip. He were given to drink, and when he were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother most unmerciful. If it were a'most the only hammering he did, indeed, excepting at myself, and if he hammered at me with a wigger only to be equalled by the wigger which he didn't hammer at his anvil. You're a listening and understanding, Pip?" "Yes, Joe." "Consequence, my mother and me, we ran away from my father several times, and then my mother, she'd go out to work, and she'd say, 'Joe,' she'd say, 'now please God you shall have some schooling, child,' and she'd put me to school. But my father were that good in his heart that he couldn't a bear to be without us, so he'd come with a most tremenjous crowd, and make such a row at the doors of the houses where we was, that they used to be obligated to have no more to do with us, and to give us up to him, and then he took us home and hammered us, which you see, Pip," said Joe, pausing in his meditative raking of the fire, and looking at me, "were a drawback on my learning. Certainly, poor Joe. Though mind you, Pip," said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, "rendering unto all their due, and maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see?" I didn't see, but I didn't say so. "Well," Joe pursued, "somebody must keep the pot a biling, Pip, or the pot won't boil, don't you know? I saw that and said so. Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too, if he would have followed it, and I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time I were able to keep him, and I kept him till he went off in a purpleptic fit, and it were my intentions to have had put upon his tombstone that, whatsoever the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart." Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity but I asked him if he had made it himself. I made it, said Joe, my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. I couldn't credit my own. To tell you the truth, hardly believed it were my own. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have it cut over him. But poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, small or large, and it were not done. Not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health and quite broke. She weren't long a following, poor soul, and her share of peace come round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. He rubbed first one of them and then the other in a most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner, with the round knob on the top of the poker. It were but lonesome then, said Joe, living here alone, and I got acquainted with your sister. Now, Pip, Joe looked firmly at me as if he knew I was not going to agree with him. Your sister is a fine figure of a woman. I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. Whatever family opinions, or whatever the world's opinions on that subject may be, Pip, your sister is. Joe tapped the top bar with the poker after every word following, a fine figure of a woman. I could think of nothing better to say than, I'm glad you think so, Joe. So am I, returned Joe, catching me up. I'm glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone, here or there, what does it signify to me? I sagaciously observed, if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? Certainly, assented Joe. That's it, you're right, old chap. When I got acquainted with your sister, it was the talk of how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her, too. All the folks said, and I said along with all the folks, as to you, Joe pursued with a countenance expressive of seeing something very nasty indeed, if you could have been aware of how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have had formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself. Not exactly relishing this, I said. Never mind me, Joe. But I did mind you, Pip, he returned with tender simplicity. When I offered to your sister to keep company, and to be asked in church at such times as she were willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, and bring the poor little child. God bless the poor little child, I said to your sister. There's room for him at the forge. I broke out crying and begging pardon, and hugged Joe round the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me, and to say, ever the best of friends, and us, Pip. Don't cry, old chap. When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed. Well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. Now, when you take me in hand in my learning, Pip, and I'll tell you beforehand I'm awful dull, most awful dull. Mrs. Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, as I may say, on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip. He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. Your sister is given to government. Given to government, Joe? I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea, and I'm afraid I must add, hope, that Joe had divorced her in favour of the Lords of the Admiralty or Treasury. Given to government, said Joe, which I mean to say the government of you and myself. Oh, and she ain't over partial to having scholars on the premises, Joe continued, and in particular would not be over partial to my being a scholar, for fear as I might rise like a sort of rebel, don't you see? I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as why, when Joe stopped me. Stay a bit. I know what you're going to say, Pip. Stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes a mogul over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us backfalls, and she do drop down upon us heavy. At such times when your sister is on the rampage, Pip, Joe sank his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. Candour compels for to admit that she is a buster. Joe pronounced this word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off, Pip? Yes, Joe. Well, said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation. Your sister's a mastermind, a mastermind. What's that? I asked, in some strange hope of bringing him to a stand. But Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circularly and answering with a fixed look, "Her? And I ain't a mastermind," Joe resumed, when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. "And last of all, Pip, and this I want to say very serious to you, old chap, I see so much in my poor mother, of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart and never getting no peace in her mortal days, that I'm dead afraid of going wrong in that way, of not doing what's right by a woman, and I'd far rather of the two go wrong t'other way and be a little inconvenience myself. I wish it was only me that got put out, Pip. I wish there weren't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself. But this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip, and I hope you'll overlook shortcomings." Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equals afterwards, as we had been before. But afterwards, at quiet times, when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. "However," said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, "here's the Dutch clock, working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of them, and she's not come home yet. I'll hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare mayn't have set a forefoot on a piece of ice and gone down." Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment, Uncle Pumblechook being a bachelor and reposing no confidences in his domestic servant. This was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chase car. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out on the marshes, I thought. And then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. "Here comes a mare," said Joe, ringing like a peal of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical, as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that they may see a bright window, and took a final survey of the kitchen, that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up, wrapped to the eyes. Mrs. Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblechook was soon down too, covering the mare with a cloth, and we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive all the heat out of the fire. "Now," said Mrs. Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders where it hung by the strings, "if this boy ain't grateful this night, he never will be." I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could who was wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. "It's only to be hoped," said my sister, "that he won't be pomp-eyed, but I have my fears." "She ain't in that line, mum," said Mr. Pumblechook. "She knows better." "She?" I looked at
Yes!